On a fog-drenched night in 2015, a homeless man named Eli Ward was last seen standing on Grayford Bridge, his battered cart left abandoned mid-span, his figure swallowed by the mist. Police assumed the obvious, another quiet suicide, another name lost to the river's silence. No body, no answers, no one to ask questions. The case froze, forgotten. But 10 years later, something surfaced, not in the water, but in a photograph. Among a bustling street crowd, a familiar face appeared. The man who had supposedly vanished was alive, watching, waiting, hiding in plain sight. On the night of October 17, 2015, the fog over Grayford Bridge was so thick it swallowed the yellow glow of the street lamps, leaving the long steel span looking more like a tunnel into nothingness than a crossing over the Blackwater River. At that hour, most of the city slept. Traffic was sparse, the occasional truck groaning across the westbound lane, its sound dulled by the damp air. For years, the eastbound pedestrian walkway had been nearly deserted after dark. Locals avoided it, not because of crime, but because of its unnerving isolation. The bridge was old, its rusted girders streaked with decades of rainwater and salt, and the air there always seemed a few degrees colder than anywhere else in town. It was along this walkway that 47-year-old Eli Ward was seen for the last time. Eli had been part of the city's background for over a decade. He wasn't the kind of homeless man people crossed the street to avoid. Instead, he was a quiet fixture, a tall, lean figure with a sun-worn face, often pushing a battered metal cart piled with scrap, aluminum cans, and the occasional old appliance frame. Those who knew him from soup kitchens and shelter lines say he rarely asked for anything, preferring to barter what he collected for food. His cart was his livelihood, and he guarded it closely, never leaving it unattended. That's why what happened next never made sense to anyone who knew him. Around 11:40 p.m., two separate witnesses reported seeing Eli about halfway across the bridge. One was a cab driver returning from an airport drop-off. He described Eli as just standing there, looking over the side like he was thinking about something heavy. The other was a jogger, doing a late-night run despite the fog, who said Eli wasn't pacing or fidgeting. He was still, both hands on the railing, eyes fixed on the black rippling water far below. Neither witness saw him leave. Neither noticed anyone else on the walkway. By morning, Grayford Bridge looked much as it always did, except for one detail. Parked at the exact midpoint of the pedestrian side was Eli's cart, positioned at an angle, one of its wheels jammed into the drainage grate that ran along the curb. Inside were his usual scavenged items, scrap metal rods, a bent car antenna, 2 empty paint cans, but nothing personal. No backpack, no food wrappers, no wallet, though few were sure he even carried one. It was as if he'd stepped away for a moment and simply never returned. When police were called just after 7 a.m., their response was procedural but unhurried. Officers photographed the scene, took statements from the morning commuters who had noticed the cart, and quickly ran Eli's name through the system. He had no recent criminal activity, no listed next of kin, no known address beyond transient. A missing persons report was opened, but internally, most assumed it was another bridge suicide. The location had a quiet history of them, though rarely in broad daylight or with witnesses. That assumption guided what came next. A dive team was sent into the river by noon, their small boat maneuvering between the thick pilings beneath the bridge. The current was sluggish in the upper stretch, but visibility in the water was poor, the silt clouding everything after only a few strokes. They searched until dusk, finding nothing, not even clothing fragments or signs of a fall. A second sweep the following day focused downstream toward the southern marsh, but again turned up empty. The lead investigator, a veteran sergeant named Paul Hanley, told local reporters there was no sign of recovery and that it was likely the body has been carried beyond our search range. For the city, that was the end of it. There were no candlelight vigils, no headlines beyond a 2-paragraph note in the local paper. Eli had no family to push for answers, no one to demand a longer search. His absence was noted quietly by those who had served him soup, who had seen him digging through dumpsters behind hardware stores, who had nodded to him in passing. But for everyone else, The story of the man on the bridge was just another brief mystery swallowed by the river. Yet the details, the cart left mid-span, the lack of evidence in the water, the witnesses who saw him still there minutes before midnight would linger for years in the minds of the few who couldn't quite accept the suicide theory. Even in 2015, one or two people wondered aloud why a man who never left his cart unguarded would abandon it so suddenly. Why there were no footprints, no dragged marks on the rail, no hint of a struggle, and why the foggy stillness of that night seemed to hide more than just the far bank of the river. Those questions would eventually resurface, but only after a decade had passed, and after one photograph would bring Eli Ward's name back into the city's memory. When detectives began the slow, methodical process of piecing together Eli Ward's life, they quickly discovered there was almost nothing to piece together. Official records showed him drifting in and out of view like a shadow. A single arrest for trespassing back in 2004, after being found sleeping in a condemned warehouse, a scattering of handwritten names on shelter intake logs, each one dated months or even years apart. Beyond that, his existence was documented only in the small ways people leave impressions without trying. Faces in the background of charity event photos, faded Polaroids pinned to bulletin boards in church basements, a man hunched over a paper bowl of soup while others around him chatted and laughed. He was remembered, but never truly known. Volunteers at the Gray Street Mission could recall him arriving quietly at mealtimes, nodding in thanks and slipping out again before the evening sermon began. He never caused trouble, never raised his voice, never asked for more than what was offered. One of them, a woman named Denise Hargrove, remembered something odd from months before his disappearance. She said Eli had been repairing the wheel of his cart near the shelter's back steps when she walked past and heard him whistle a hymn she recognized from her childhood. She remarked on it, and he replied without looking up. Bridges aren't just for crossing, they're for leaving things behind. She thought it was just one of his strange musings, but after he vanished, those words began to sound heavier, almost rehearsed. Rumors, as they always do, began to fill the gaps left by the absence of facts. Some said Eli had gotten himself into trouble with a man who dealt in stolen scrap downtown, a man with a history of beating those who didn't pay their debts. Others swore they'd seen him having one-sided conversations in alleyways, pausing as if someone just out of sight had spoken back. A few said he'd been more restless in the weeks before he vanished, pacing in circles near the bridge, sometimes staring at the road with a strange, fixed expression. No one could agree whether this meant he was afraid, planning something, or losing touch with reality. Police followed these threads for as long as resources allowed, but the lack of hard evidence made each lead collapse under its own weight. The violent man downtown was interviewed, denied knowing Eli, and was never tied to him by witnesses willing to give a formal statement. The invisible conversations were chalked up to the talk one hears about anyone living rough for years. Detectives leaned heavily on the assumption that Eli's disappearance was voluntary, whether by jumping or by simply walking away into another city. Without proof of foul play, the file slid steadily toward closure. 3 months after his last sighting, the official search ended. The Missing Persons Unit issued a brief internal memo declaring there was no further investigative direction. The bridge, the cart, and the foggy October night became little more than a passing footnote in departmental archives. No one from the public came forward to challenge it. Eli had no family registered in the state, no one to file appeals or demand reinvestigation. For the police, the matter was settled, but for one man, it wasn't. Tom Weaver, a retired postal worker with no formal training in law enforcement, had been following Eli's story since the day the cart was found. He'd seen him countless times on his morning route, always on the same stretch of road leading to the bridge, head down, pushing that rattling cart of metal and scrap. Something about the case gnawed at him. The abandonment of the cart, the lack of evidence in the water, the way Eli seemed to vanish without the smallest trace of departure. Tom began quietly collecting what others discarded. He clipped newspaper snippets, downloaded archived shelter rosters, and photographed the bridge from every angle, studying the distances and sight lines described by witnesses. He spoke to anyone who had known Eli, no matter how briefly, scribbling their recollections into a notebook with meticulous dates and times. Slowly, he built a timeline of Eli's movements in the weeks before he disappeared, noting subtle shifts in his routine, longer periods spent on the bridge, fewer visits to the mission, and a growing tendency to avoid certain streets entirely. It was obsessive work for someone with no clear goal, but Tom couldn't explain it except to say that it didn't add up. He believed Eli's absence was not the result of despair, but of something done to him, something orchestrated to look like a solitary end on a fog-shrouded bridge. And though the police file was now closed and gathering dust, Tom's own file, stored in a locked desk drawer in his modest apartment, was still open. In it lay every scrap of Eli Ward's thinly documented life, waiting for the day something, anything, would break the silence that had swallowed him whole. Tom's first real lead came from the kind of people the police rarely went back to once a report was filed, the ones whose lives played out in the shadows on the edges of the city's official maps. Two men who fished at night from the concrete embankment beneath Grayford Bridge agreed to meet him after weeks of him asking around. They were wary, chain-smoking through most of the conversation, but their account was clear. They claimed that just before midnight on the night Eli vanished, they saw him on the pedestrian side of the bridge speaking to another man. The fog was thick, and the street lamps above were dull halos, but they remembered the figure in the dark coat standing close, angled toward Eli as if in a private conversation. The fishermen couldn't hear the words over the water and passing trucks, but they said it didn't look heated, no shoving, no raised voices, just two men standing face to face at the bridge's midpoint. When Tom pressed them for details, they hesitated. They couldn't say the man's age or build with confidence. The coat was heavy, maybe wool, and the man kept his head down. When Tom asked if they'd told police, they said they had, but the officers never called them back. Hoping to find something physical to back up the sighting, Tom tracked down old forensic notes from the police file. The bridge walkway had been examined for signs of a fall or struggle, footprints near the railing, skid marks, damaged paint, but nothing was found. No signs that anyone had gone over the side, voluntarily or otherwise. That bothered Tom. Even in fog, a fall over a steel barrier usually left some sign. The absence of one didn't prove Eli hadn't jumped, but it kept the possibility alive that he hadn't been anywhere near the edge when he disappeared. A retired hydrologist who had worked with the search team gave Tom another piece of the puzzle. The river currents on that specific night were slow-moving near the bridge, but the tidal pull downstream would have carried a body toward the southern marsh within 48 hours. That marsh was a wide, muddy tangle of reeds and brackish water that often caught debris, and search crews had swept it thoroughly in the week after Eli's disappearance. If he had gone into the river that night, the hydrologist said, they almost certainly would have found him, or at least something, by then. But they didn't. It was this gap in the physical evidence that made what happened next so unsettling. Through a chain of acquaintances, Tom was put in touch with a transient woman who sometimes slept in the underpass near the bridge. She was skittish, speaking in short bursts and glancing over her shoulder, even when they met in a public park. Her claim was simple but startling. She swore she saw Eli that night, minutes after he was last spotted on the bridge. He was walking down a narrow service road that curved beneath the eastern span toward a small gravel turnout used by delivery trucks. A dark-colored pickup was idling there, and she saw Eli climb into the passenger seat before the truck pulled away without headlights. Tom knew what her testimony could mean, that Eli hadn't vanished into the water at all, but had been picked up and driven away. Whether he went willingly or under duress was another question entirely. But when he brought the information to the police, they dismissed it almost instantly. The woman had a documented history of mental illness and substance abuse, and her account, they argued, was too shaky to act on. No one bothered to canvass for trucks matching her description. No security footage from nearby businesses was pulled. On paper, her claim became a short paragraph in the case notes marked unsubstantiated. For Tom, it was harder to let go. He returned to the bridge more than once, standing on the spot where the fishermen claimed Eli had been, then tracing the route down to the turnout described by the woman. From the walkway, it was possible to see the faint glow of headlights on that service road if the fog thinned, but in the thick, damp air of that October night, it would have been easy for anyone on the bridge to miss what was happening just below. The location of the turnout meant that a truck could be parked there, engine running, entirely invisible to anyone passing by above. He began sketching out two parallel timelines for that night. In one, Eli lingered on the bridge before climbing over the rail into the river, his cart left behind in a moment of finality. In the other, he stepped away from the railing, met the man in the dark coat, and walked off the bridge alive, only to disappear into a waiting vehicle, never to be seen again. The first theory fit the police's quick conclusion. The second was harder to prove, but refused to leave Tom's mind. And with no new evidence and the years beginning to stack up, it was the kind of theory that would quietly fade until nearly a decade later, when a single photograph would rip the case open again. In the years that followed, the river kept its silence. Whatever happened on Grayford Bridge that fog-heavy night remained locked beneath the surface, or perhaps never touched the water at all. For most, the case had long since dissolved into memory, but for Tom Weaver, it remained an open wound. His modest apartment became a quiet archive dedicated to one man's absence. Inside, a locked oak cabinet sat binders thick with printed witness statements, hand-drawn maps of the bridge and surrounding roads, and photographs of the river taken in every season. Even the smallest scraps, a shelter sign-in sheet, a blurry news clipping, a name overheard in conversation, found a place in his growing collection. To Tom, Eli's disappearance had the shape of something deliberate. Theories of suicide or aimless wandering didn't fit. It was cleaner than that, too clean. As months became years, Grayford Bridge itself began to change in the public imagination. The steel span, once just an aging piece of infrastructure, took on a darker reputation. News stories about unrelated incidents in the area would use it as a backdrop, hinting at its history without naming names. People began to say it was the place where you could walk in and never walk out. Late-night drivers swore they felt a chill crossing its midpoint. Fewer pedestrians ventured across after dark. Even the fishermen who once lined the embankments below began to drift away, muttering that it wasn't worth it anymore. It became, in a quiet, unofficial way, a place of vanishings. By 2018, the case had sat cold for nearly 3 years. Police no longer returned Tom's calls. The only new information came in accidental flashes, like the one that surfaced from a construction worker repairing the eastern guardrail. The man had been tasked with replacing corroded bolts and repainting the steel when he spotted something unusual in a deep groove where rust had eaten into the metal. Wedged between layers of flaking paint was a thin, weathered tag, the kind used to label keys or luggage. It was coated in grime and pitted from years of exposure, but faint blocky letters were still visible. EW. Word of the find reached Tom through a friend at the Department of Public Works. He managed to see it before it was cataloged, turning the small rectangle over in his hand, tracing the initials with his thumb. The tag was sent for testing, revealing significant oxidation and mineral deposits consistent with years of exposure to the bridge's damp, salt-heavy air. Experts concluded it had likely been lodged there for several years, possibly even before 2015. No one could say for certain if it had been placed there intentionally or simply caught in the structure by chance. Tom wanted to believe it was Eli's, some trace left behind on that final night, maybe from a key he'd carried or a bag long since lost. But the tag was just one more piece of something bigger, a fragment without a clear connection, unable to push the case forward on its own. Police acknowledged it in their files, but took no further action, noting that without a body, a crime scene, or new evidence, its value was purely speculative. Still, the discovery stirred something in Tom. It was proof, however small, that Eli had been more than just a rumor. Something tangible existed in that space, something tied to his name. But as quickly as it appeared, it too was swallowed by the inertia of a cold case. The tag was boxed and stored with other unrelated evidence from the bridge, its presence reduced to a line item in a report few would ever read. Outside official channels, the bridge's legend deepened. Stories about the tag began circulating online, morphing with each retelling. In some versions, it was a dog tag from Eli's army days. In others, a piece of a lock he'd used to secure his cart. None were true, but each carried the same unspoken implication, that Eli's ghost lingered there in some physical form. Tom hated the way the facts were bent into myth, but he couldn't stop them. The truth had too little weight against the pull of a good story. By the winter of that year, Tom's cabinet of files was so full he'd begun stacking boxes on the floor. He still walked the bridge regularly, watching the patterns of pedestrians and traffic, scanning the shadows beneath the beams. Each trip ended the same way, with the sound of the river below, steady and unreadable, offering nothing. The silence was its own answer, one he refused to accept. What Tom didn't know, what no one knew then, was that the quiet around the case wasn't permanent. The bridge had more to give, but it wouldn't be in the form of a clue rusted into its bones. The break would come from somewhere far from the river, years later, in a single image captured without intention, one that would pull Eli Ward's name back into the present and force everyone to look again at what they thought they knew. By 2023, the name Eli Ward meant little to anyone beyond a shrinking circle of people who had been there when he vanished. The city had moved on, the bridge had been repainted, and whatever small curiosity the case had sparked was long buried under newer stories. In a locked evidence box in the basement of the precinct, his life was reduced to a few objects sealed in plastic: an old army jacket with frayed cuffs, a dented harmonica dulled with fingerprints, and 2 water-stained notebooks whose pages had blurred into illegibility. They hadn't been touched in years. Even the officers who'd once handled them barely remembered the man they belonged to. That obscurity might have lasted forever if not for an unrelated project by the local historical society. As part of a citywide preservation grant, volunteers began digitizing thousands of old photographs to create a public archive. Most were routine: parades, school events, charity drives, the kind of images that linger in storage for decades. But during the process, a volunteer paused over a street festival photograph taken just a week earlier. The image showed a lively scene: a performer in mid-act, a small crowd gathered around. In the far left corner, slightly blurred and half-turned toward the camera, stood a man with a weathered face, sunken eyes, and a long, narrow nose that cast a familiar shadow across his cheek. Even in profile, the resemblance was undeniable to anyone who had studied the missing persons file. It looked exactly like Eli Ward. The image was dated and time-stamped by the photographer's camera, September 22, 2023, 4:18 p.m. That date was not random. It was exactly 10 years and 5 days since Eli was last seen alive on Grayford Bridge. The man in the picture didn't look like the drifter from 2015. His beard was neatly trimmed, his hair shorter. He wore a faded but intact winter coat zipped to the collar. Still, the bone structure was the same: the faint droop in the right eyelid, and what appeared to be a pale scar running along the left side of his cheek. To anyone unfamiliar with the case, he was just another passerby caught in the edge of a frame. But to the few who remembered, it was a shock strong enough to cut through years of silence. The photograph made its way from the Historical Society server to a small group of volunteers, one of whom happened to know Tom Weaver. When Tom opened the email and enlarged the image, the breath caught in his chest. He had spent nearly a decade staring at the grainy shelter IDs, the faded Polaroids from soup kitchens, the blurry security stills that made up Eli's meager photographic record. He knew every line of that face, every asymmetry. This wasn't a likeness. It was him. Older, yes, thinner, maybe, but alive. The photographer, a retired teacher, was tracked down quickly. He explained he had been taking candid crowd shots that afternoon and had no memory of the man in question. He'd noticed no one unusual, no interaction that stood out. To him, the stranger in the corner was just part of the background. The performer at the festival, however, recalled a quiet older guy who stood at the back of the crowd for most of the set, never clapping or cheering, just watching. She remembered him leaving before the performance ended, walking toward the edge of the event area and disappearing into the flow of downtown pedestrians. Tom stared at that blurred profile for hours, searching for clues in the posture, the angle of the head, the direction of the gaze. Was Eli aware of the camera? Had he been avoiding it? And why would he be here, in public, after a decade of absence? The odds of such a sighting, in broad daylight, at a well-attended event, seemed almost impossible for someone who had stayed hidden so long. Unless he hadn't been hiding at all, at least not in the way everyone thought. When the photo was quietly shown to a retired detective who had worked the original case, he admitted the resemblance was strong enough to merit attention. But without more images, it could be dismissed as coincidence. That possibility, that it might be someone else entirely, gnawed at Tom. Yet deep down, he was certain. 10 years of chasing dead ends had taught him the difference between a lead and a ghost. This was no ghost. The discovery didn't bring answers, only more questions, but it lit a fuse under the long, cold case. Somewhere in the city, Eli Ward, or someone who looked exactly like him, had been walking among strangers close enough to be photographed. For Tom, it was proof of what he had believed from the start. Eli hadn't gone into the river. He had walked away. And now, for the first time in a decade, there was a trail to follow. When the email arrived, Tom Weaver was sitting at his kitchen table, surrounded by the clutter of a man who had turned a missing person into a second career. The subject line was short. "Need you to see this?" But the single attached image made his hands still over the mouse. He clicked it open and felt the years collapse between him and the night Eli Ward disappeared. It was a high-resolution photograph, the same one from the Historical Society, but sharper, cleaner than the copy he had first been shown. Tom leaned forward until the monitor's glow filled his vision. On the far left edge of the frame, half turned from the lens, stood a man whose face was so familiar it pulled the air from the room. Tom retrieved the old shelter ID from his files. The one he had handled so often, the plastic sleeve had begun to cloud at the corners. Side by side, the similarities were unmistakable. The slight droop in the right eyelid, the faint but visible scar along the left cheek, a nose that cut the same narrow angle. The man in the new photo was older, of course, his face lined by time and weather, but there was no mistaking it. Yet he didn't look like the worn-down drifter Tom had last seen on the bridge. His beard was neatly trimmed, his winter coat zipped high and intact, not patched together from scraps. There was a steadiness in his posture, as if he were not simply surviving, but living with some degree of purpose. He called the Historical Society volunteer, who put him in touch with the photographer. The man was polite but unhelpful, insisting he remembered nothing unusual that day. He had been documenting the festival for the organizers, wandering through the crowd snapping candid shots. The figure in the corner was just someone who happened to be standing there. No conversation, no interaction, no moment that stood out. The street performer offered more, though not much. She remembered a quiet older guy near the back, watching for most of her set but never applauding. He stayed still, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on her until, partway through, he slipped away toward the street. She assumed he'd just lost interest. There was nothing in his behavior to suggest he had been gone from the city for a decade. Tom knew the police would have to see it, though experience told him what their first response would be. Still, the image was sent to the department's technical unit, where facial recognition software was used to compare it to archived images of Eli. Hours later, the results came back. A 92% match flagged as unverified due to the natural aging differences over 10 years. It was as close to confirmation as Tom could have hoped for without fingerprints or DNA, but instead of acting, the police treated it like a curiosity. Without recent sightings, they said, there was no active case to reopen. People changed, they reminded him. Scars faded, faces shifted. Maybe it was Eli, maybe it wasn't. The system couldn't say for sure, and without certainty they wouldn't commit resources. For Tom, the idea that the man in the photo might not be Eli was absurd. He had spent too many years studying every trace of him to mistake someone else for the same profile, the same scar, the same subtle asymmetry in the eyes. The picture wasn't just a resemblance, it was a breadcrumb, a sign that Eli had been out there all along, not drowned in the Blackwater River, not lying in an unmarked grave, but moving through the city in plain sight. What troubled Tom most was the setting. A crowded festival wasn't where someone who had been avoiding detection for years would choose to be, unless he no longer cared about being seen, or, more unsettling, unless he was certain no one who mattered would recognize him. The photograph didn't just reopen the case in Tom's mind, it changed its shape entirely. Eli's disappearance was no longer just about what had happened that night on the bridge. It was about what he had been doing every day since, and why. And though the police closed their file with a note about the unverified likeness, Tom began to prepare for something he hadn't done in years, an active search. The photo was proof enough for him, and he knew exactly where to start. Somewhere in the crowd that day, Eli had stood still long enough for a camera to find him. If Tom could trace his steps backward from that moment, he might finally catch up to the man who had spent a decade just out of reach. The photograph set off a ripple that the city hadn't felt in years. What had started as a curiosity inside the local historical society was suddenly enough for the precinct to dust off a name they had barely spoken in a decade. The resemblance was too strong to ignore, and while the official line was preliminary follow-up, the shift in tone was unmistakable. The small plaza where the festival had been held was the first stop. Detectives moved from one end to the other, going door to door with a printout of the man's face, asking the same question again and again. Had anyone seen him on the day this picture was taken? Most gave the answer they expected: no. The festival drew hundreds, sometimes thousands of people from across the county. Strangers came, stayed a few hours, and left without anyone remembering their faces. But two conversations stood out. Both witnesses, interviewed separately, described the same thing. Earlier that afternoon, before the music and street performances reached full swing, the man had been sitting on a bench near the public library. One woman had noticed him because she passed that bench every day on her way to work. She remembered a cigarette burning between his fingers, a slow exhale of smoke curling into the early autumn air. She thought nothing of him until, 30 minutes later, she walked back past and saw him still there, now lighting a second cigarette. His gaze fixed somewhere beyond the steady stream of pedestrians. The second witness, a food truck owner, recalled the man's stillness. Not scrolling on a phone, not reading, just sitting, he told them, like he was waiting, but not for anyone who was coming soon. Detectives hoped the library's exterior cameras might have caught him, but their system overwrote footage every 7 days. By the time they asked, it was gone. Luck came instead from a cafe across the street that kept a 3-week archive. At 2:41 p.m. on the day of the festival, the man in the photograph appeared on the edge of the frame. He was partially obscured, the focus aimed at the counter inside, but as a customer walked past him outside, he turned his head slightly toward the street. The angle was brief, but it was enough. Across his left cheek, faint but visible, was the thin, pale scar that Tom Weaver knew by heart. A still image from that footage went into rotation. Officers carried copies into shops, shelters, and bus stops within a half-mile radius. In places where security cameras were mounted over the doorways, detectives asked to scan the relevant hours. In more transient spaces, alleys behind restaurants, the back entrances of hostels that accepted cash, they relied on memory. The responses were fragmented, unreliable. A few said they might have seen him walking south. Others swore he'd turned west toward the underpass. No one could say definitively where he'd gone after leaving the plaza. By the next morning, the trail was already cooling. For Tom, that was the most telling part. This man, if it was Eli, and he had no doubt that it was, had been found by accident. The photograph wasn't the result of someone tracking him. It was a fluke. Yet within hours of that image being taken, he had melted back into the city without leaving a mark. That wasn't the behavior of someone caught off guard for the first time. That was someone practiced at disappearing. Tom began laying out possible routes on paper, tracing how a person could get from the cafe's doorway to the point where no one could place them within an hour. Every line he drew ran through the same places: narrow service alleys, low-rent hostels with no electronic records, the tent clusters hidden behind construction sites, and the shelters where names were recorded in pencil, if at all. The more he studied the pattern, the more convinced he became that Eli had been living deliberately off the grid for the entire 10 years he'd been gone. This wasn't homelessness in the way most imagined it. It was a controlled absence, a life built on slipping through cracks so narrow most people never saw them. It was the kind of existence that required constant vigilance, an awareness of who might be watching and from where. Tom had seen it before in people who owed money to the wrong hands or who were running from a threat they couldn't fight head-on. That thought carried him back, inevitably, to the bridge. If Eli was hiding, then whatever he was hiding from had started that night. Whether it was the man in the dark coat described by the fisherman, the pickup truck seen by the transient woman, or something else entirely. Tom believed the reason for Eli's self-imposed invisibility was still out there. It wasn't just about avoiding the police or the past. It was about staying beyond reach of a specific danger. Meanwhile, the police kept their investigation within narrow boundaries. Without confirmation of his identity, they couldn't justify a wide-scale search. They canvassed for a week, followed up on a handful of weak tips, and filed the results under pending. The festival had ended, the streets had emptied, and any trace Eli might have left in that brief reemergence had been swept away by the churn of the city. Tom refused to let it stop there. In his apartment, he tacked the new still image to the center of his wall, surrounding it with the shelter IDs, the soup kitchen Polaroids, and the blurry news footage from years before. The change was undeniable. Older, leaner, perhaps healthier, but the same eyes looked out from both. For Tom, that was all the proof he needed. The question now wasn't whether Eli was alive. It was how to find him before he disappeared again for another decade. Somewhere in the city, he was walking streets Tom might have crossed himself that very week, sitting on benches, smoking, watching the world without being part of it. All it would take was one more sighting, one more slip, to close the distance. But the city has a way of protecting those who know how to vanish. And if Eli Ward had learned anything in the last 10 years, it was that even in plain sight, you could still be nowhere at all. The first meaningful lead since the festival surfaced in an unremarkable place, the quiet main branch of the city library. A week after the photograph began circulating, a librarian phoned the detectives, her voice measured but certain. She believed she had seen the man in the image, not during the festival, but the very next morning. He had come in just after the doors opened, walking with the kind of unhurried caution that made her notice him. She remembered the coat, dark, zipped high, and the way he avoided eye contact as he approached the public computer terminals. He stayed for less than an hour, she said, and when he left, he didn't check out any books, speak to anyone, or even glance around. Something about him, she added, felt as if he had somewhere specific to be, but nowhere he could stay. The library kept basic system logs for each computer, recording the websites accessed during a session. At the detective's request, the IT staff pulled the logs from that morning. One entry stood out immediately, a veterans benefits portal, accessed under a profile that required a personal ID number. The name attached to the account wasn't Eli Ward. It was Elias Warren, but the birth date in the profile was the same as Eli's, down to the year. The detectives dug deeper. The benefits account had been active for nearly a decade, registered not to a home address, but to a P.O. box in a small industrial town 60 miles away. Records showed it had received modest deposits, rarely more than a few $100s, at regular 2-month intervals. The payments had stopped briefly in late 2016, then resumed under a slightly different routing number. Whoever Elias Warren was, someone had been quietly keeping money in his hands for 10 years. Tracing the deposits led the investigation in a direction no one had anticipated. The routing number was tied to a bank account once held by a now-defunct trucking company. The company had closed shortly after the death of its owner, a man named Charles Denton, in November 2016. Denton had a reputation in certain corners of the city. He was known to hire transient laborers for cash, often off the books, the kind of work that never appeared on payrolls or tax records. More than one person described him as a man who liked to own the people he helped, finding them jobs, housing, and then holding those favors over their heads. The connection between Denton and the bridge was thin, but it was there. In the months before Eli vanished, Denton's trucks were often seen parked in the service lot beneath the east side of the bridge. Officially, they were there to collect scrap metal from a recycling yard just up the road. Unofficially, some drivers admitted that Denton would pick up men looking for work right off the street. No questions asked, no paperwork, just a ride in exchange for labor. For Tom Weaver, the pieces began to take on a shape he'd always suspected, but never been able to outline. If Eli had been Elias for the last decade, living under an alias connected to Denton's payroll, then the night on the bridge might not have been a suicide attempt gone unseen. It could have been the beginning of something else entirely, a deliberate extraction hidden in plain sight. The pickup truck the transient woman claimed to have seen all those years ago suddenly seemed less like a dismissed fantasy and more like the missing link. The detectives approached the bank for additional records, hoping to track where the deposits originated after Denton's death. The trail, however, was murky. The account appeared to have been kept open by someone using Denton's old business credentials, routing money through a chain of small transfers that masked the original source. Whoever it was had managed to stay invisible in the banking system for years. It was enough to keep a man like Eli housed, clothed, and fed, but not enough to draw attention from agencies that might ask questions. Even with the alias, the deposits, and the Denton connection, the police were cautious. Without direct confirmation from Eli himself, they couldn't prove that Elias Warren and Eli Ward were the same person. The information went into the file, but no immediate action was taken. For Tom, that inaction was maddening. Here was a thread that could be followed, a trail that ran straight back to the bridge, and the night everything changed. But each time he pushed, the response was the same. It wasn't enough. Late one night, sitting at his kitchen table, surrounded by the weight of 10 years' worth of notes, Tom wrote two names side by side, Eli Ward and Elias Warren. Beneath them, he wrote Charles Denton. Then he drew a line from Denton's name to the bridge, and another from the bridge to the photograph at the festival. The path was crooked, incomplete, but for the first time in years, it felt like more than just dots on a page. Somewhere between those names and that place was the truth about why Eli had stepped away from his cart in the fog and never come back. What Tom couldn't yet see was how close that truth actually was. The pieces were already there, in the library logs, in the bank records, in the memory of a woman whose account had been dismissed years before. All it would take now was finding Eli again, catching him long enough to ask the questions that had been waiting since that night in 2015. And if the man in the photograph really was him, the next encounter would finally tear down the wall of silence he had spent a decade building. For weeks, detectives rotated quietly between the city library, the surrounding shelters, and the small network of food missions downtown. They didn't advertise what they were looking for, knowing that if the man in the festival photo really was Eli Ward, the smallest sign of a search might send him vanishing again. The watch was patient, almost methodical, and for a long stretch, uneventful. Then, on a damp Thursday evening, the break came. Two officers sitting in an unmarked car near the Hope Street night mission saw him. He was thinner than in the photo, his coat zipped high, collar turned up, but the profile was unmistakable. He moved with a kind of quiet purpose toward the door, slowing just enough to let others pass before stepping inside. They waited until he emerged, a small paper bag of donated food in his hand. When the officers approached, he glanced at them once, his face unreadable, then turned sharply to his left as if to walk away. There was no rush in his stride, no panic, but it was clear he intended to put distance between himself and the two men in plain clothes. They caught up easily, speaking low, asking his name. He didn't answer. One officer mentioned the name Eli, and for the first time, his gaze shifted to meet theirs. It lasted only a second before he looked away. They didn't cuff him, didn't raise their voices. They simply told him they needed to talk. At the station, in a small interview room, he sat with his hands folded, his posture rigid but not defiant. When asked directly if he was Eli Ward, he was silent at first. The pause stretched until it felt like it might break the air in the room. Then, finally, he nodded once. Yes, he was Eli. But when pressed on where he had been for the last 10 years, the wall went up again. He said nothing, eyes fixed on the tabletop, jaw set tight. It took hours, and the patient persistence of a detective who knew when to leave silence alone before fragments began to slip through. He spoke without embellishment, as if reciting something fixed in his mind for years. On the night of his disappearance, he said, he hadn't intended to go far. He had been standing on the bridge, as he often did, when a man approached. Someone he'd known years earlier, a familiar enough face from the street. The man had told him he could get him food, maybe even some work, if he was willing to take a short ride. Eli had followed him down the East End service road where a pickup waited. He climbed in. What followed was not a job offer. The truck drove for hours, leaving the lights of the city behind until the road narrowed and turned to gravel. They arrived at a rural property deep enough in the woods that no neighboring houses were visible. There, Eli said. The terms changed. He was told he could stay in a small room above a garage, but in exchange he would work, hauling scrap, repairing pallets, cleaning equipment, for cash that never seemed to reach his hands. Meals were given, but money was kept for expenses. Each time he mentioned leaving, the response was the same. There was nowhere to go, no way to get there, and no one who would care if he didn't come back. The threats were never shouted, but they were clear. The years blurred. He worked every day, ate what was given, and kept to himself. The property's owner controlled the truck, the supplies, the mail. Sometimes he would disappear for days, leaving Eli with a list of tasks and the unspoken reminder that the woods around him could swallow a man who didn't know the way out. There was no talk of police, only quiet suggestions of what could happen if he was found wandering where he didn't belong. In late 2016, the man died. Eli didn't say how, only that one day he was gone, and the property felt empty in a way it never had before. He left within hours, walking until he reached a road, then taking rides from strangers until he found himself in a small town miles from anywhere familiar. He didn't go back to the city, not right away. For years, he drifted between towns, finding work for cash, staying off any list that could trace him. The money that came every couple of months, always the same small amount, was enough to keep him moving, enough to avoid questions. When asked why he hadn't come forward, why he had let the world believe he'd gone into the river, Eli said only that it was safer that way. He didn't explain what safer meant, and no amount of prompting could get him to. The way he spoke made it clear he still believed someone, somewhere, might be looking for him, or for the story he carried. By the time the interview ended, they knew more about the missing years than anyone had in a decade. But the most important question, the full truth of what happened on the bridge and why, still waited, locked behind the same guarded silence that had kept Eli Ward invisible for 10 long years. And for Tom Weaver, hearing that Eli was alive was only part of the resolution he had been chasing. The real answer lay in the final gaps of a story that was finally, painfully, beginning to surface. In the weeks after Eli's quiet admission, investigators pushed to verify every fragment of his account. The rural property he described still existed, its new owner cooperative and more than willing to let them search. It had changed hands in 2017, a year after the death of Charles Denton, the trucker whose name had already surfaced in connection to the alias Elias Warren. The garage loft where Eli claimed to have lived was still there, a narrow room with low ceilings, bare walls, and a single window facing a stand of trees. In the dust and debris left behind from years of disuse, officers found a warped metal frame that matched the dimensions of a cot, a rusted space heater, and, wedged behind a set of rotting shelves, a weather-stained harmonica. It was the same make and model recorded in Eli's property inventory when he first appeared in police records years earlier. The harmonica wasn't the only connection. In a battered trunk beneath the workbench were old payroll ledgers from Denton's trucking company. They were handwritten, some in pencil, others in ink faded to brown. Most of the names were first names only or nicknames, Red, Slim, Jerry P. But near the back of the 2015 ledger was a listing for E. Warren, the alias that had kept appearing in the veteran's account records. The entries stopped abruptly in October of that year, the same week Eli vanished from Grayford Bridge. Alongside the ledgers, sealed in a garbage bag, was a military-issue field jacket, its lining torn, the name Ward still faintly visible on the fabric tag. The property's location matched another detail, too. The narrow service road and gravel turnout where a transient woman had once claimed to see Eli get into a pickup truck on the night of his disappearance. Her statement, dismissed in 2015 as unreliable, was suddenly reframed as the most accurate account anyone had given. She had been telling the truth the entire time. The emerging picture was stark. Denton had taken Eli under the guise of offering work and shelter, isolating him on a property far from anyone who might have noticed his absence. What followed wasn't overt imprisonment. There were no locks on the doors, no chains, but the effect was the same. Eli had no transportation, no phone, and no money of his own. Every trip off the property was controlled, every resource filtered through Denton. The arrangement ensured dependency, reinforced by the constant implication that trying to leave would end badly. Over time, Eli's world had shrunk to the boundaries of that rural lot. When Denton died in 2016, Eli walked away, but not toward freedom in the traditional sense. He didn't return to the city or to the people who might have remembered him. Instead, he built a life around staying untraceable, the same survival pattern Denton had imposed, only now self-enforced. The deposits into the veterans account were almost certainly remnants of Denton's old cash network, kept alive by someone who had inherited or maintained pieces of his business. Whether it was an act of obligation, guilt, or simple habit, no one could say. What became clear was that the night on the bridge had never been a spontaneous disappearance. Denton had orchestrated it. The cart left mid-span, the timing just before midnight, the fog, all of it had created a scene that could be read as a suicide without leaving hard evidence. It had allowed Denton to remove Eli without anyone searching for a living man. The police search had focused on the river, not the roads beneath it, and in doing so, they had missed the only direction Eli had actually gone. 10 years later, the case file was updated with the new findings. The official determination was that Eli Ward had been a victim of coercion and exploitation, effectively held in near captivity for more than a year before disappearing into voluntary obscurity out of fear and habit. No living suspects remained to charge. The file was marked closed, though it was understood that the truth had only surfaced because of a chance photograph taken at a street festival. When they brought Eli back to the bridge as part of a final review, he stood for a long time at the midpoint, the spot where his cart had once been found. His eyes moved over the rail to the dark water below, then along the length of the walkway, tracing the place where the city lights blurred into the fog. When a detective asked him what he was thinking, he spoke only one sentence: "That's where I stopped being me." After that day, Eli returned to the same quiet anonymity he had kept for years, declining interviews, avoiding public places. But the photograph, and the story it uncovered, had already spread. Grayford Bridge, once just another span of steel and concrete, was now indelibly tied to the decade-long mystery of the man who had walked onto it, vanished without a sound, and reappeared only when a camera caught him looking in the wrong direction. In the end, the bridge didn't just mark the place where Eli Ward disappeared. It marked the divide between the life he had before and the shadowed existence that followed. And though the case was closed, the image of that face in the festival crowd ensured neither Eli's story nor the bridge where it began would ever truly fade from memory.